Let me make sure it works. Okay. Okay, so right, I mean, this is forward, back, and this is the pointer. Okay? Got it? Okay. Cool. We're about to continue with our program. Before I introduce the next lecture, I want to just remind the current and former fellows to meet in the conservatory for group photos at 12:30. Okay, so please be there. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce the F.A. Hayek Memorial Lecture, sponsored by the estate of Stephen Hogg. The speaker is the eminent Paul H. Rubin, who is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of Economics at Emory University, past president of the Southern Economic Association, and former editor of Managerial and Decision Economics. He is associated with the Technology Policy Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Independent Institute. Dr. Rubin has been a senior fellow at President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors and has held senior positions at the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. He has taught economics at Emory, University of Georgia, University of York, VPI, University of New York, excuse me, VPI, and George Washington University Law School. Dr. Rubin has written or edited 11 books and published over 250 articles and chapters on economics, law, regulation, and evolution in professional journals. He frequently contributes to the Wall Street Journal and consults on the economics of legal issues. Dr. Rubin received his BA from the University of Cincinnati in 1963 and his PhD from Purdue University in 1970. The topic that he'll be addressing us on is how we talk about economics and why it matters. And I want to hear this. Dr. Rubin.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I'm particularly happy to do the Hayek lecture. Anyone would be proud to do a Hayek lecture, but in particular, Hayek was an early pioneer in many, of course, in huge numbers of things, but he was also one of the few scholars of his generation to understand that our evolved preferences, our evolved behaviors, our minds evolved in ways that affect our decision-making today. He was writing in the era of what's been called the standard social science model, or what Pinker has called the era of the blank slate, when social scientists thought that humans were born as blank slates and they could learn anything and behave in any way. And Hayek was one of the first earliest people to realize that that was not true. I have a quote there, which is really the basis of much of what I'm going to say, that our minds were adapted to a very different environment than the one in which we now live, and that has profound implications for economic policy and for many other things. So I'm very happy to give the Hayek lecture. A question that I address in this paper and one I've addressed over my career, really one that's puzzled me, like many people of my demographic, which is to say Jews. I started off as Walter said, Walter Block in the last session said, started off as not quite a socialist, but pretty close, a non-believer in markets. And early in my career in undergraduate school and then in graduate school, I became a free market person. And then, like many converts, I asked myself the question, how could I have believed that stuff before? And why do many other people still believe it? And that's the issue that I'm addressing today, the fact that there are, as we know, huge numbers of people who don't believe in markets. It's a puzzle to everyone in this room because we all know that markets generate huge incomes and longer lives and happier people, and yet we have the Pope out there preaching against markets. We had a recent election where Bernie Sanders and Mr. Trump, neither one of them were strong pro-market candidates, obviously, although Mr. Trump has actually turned out to be more of a market guy than we might have hoped. I'm actually fairly optimistic about some of his policies. But as a candidate, he was certainly not a pro-market guy, nor was Bernie Sanders, and yet they won the election. Brian Kaplan's book, some of you may know, The Myth of the Rational Voter, has a whole section on what he calls anti-market bias, very common among people. And of course, there are many socialist governments that are elected. The government in Venezuela, which is destroying the country, was an elected government, has been for some years. There's attempts to throw it out, but originally it was an elected socialist or communist government. I lived for a while in New York where we elected a mayor who was originally a Sandinista. Also not a pro-market guy in a city full of smart people. So there, and, I don't need to convince people here that there's strong pro-market bias, what I call emporophobia, fear of markets, exists everywhere. And it's a puzzle because markets do work so well, and we know that markets do work well. So my talk is organized in 4 parts. First, I'm going to talk about people's intuitive understanding or lack of understanding of economics. The second point I'm going to discuss is competition. And I'm going to make the point that I think we economists overemphasize competition in the economy. And I think that, I'm going to make the point that I think that.
Stay near the microphone, otherwise we can't hear you.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Here or there, we just can't hear you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Walter. Can you hear me now? So that we overemphasize the role of competition in our discussion of the economy. And then I'm going to talk about a new concept in psychology, but one I think should be much more applied in economics, called pathological altruism. And finally, I'm going to talk about the morality of the marketplace. How moral is the marketplace, and how do people perceive it? So the first point that I want to make is really Hayek's point that economics is not intuitive, that people are naturally born or early on in their lives develop what I call folk economics, set of beliefs about the economy that is not based on the way the economy really works. Why is that? Well, the point is that people do not have any intuitive understanding of economics. I use the example of speech. Everybody grows up knowing how to talk, right? A normal child in a normal environment will learn how to talk without any special effort on the part of his parents. But we don't all learn to read. We have to be taught to read. Reading is not a natural, inborn ability. Understanding of economics is like reading. We have to be taught to understand economics. We're not born with an intuitive understanding of economics. We're born with an intuitive misunderstanding of economics, if you like, in certain predictable kinds of ways. Why? Well, our brains evolved in small groups where there was some trade between individuals, maybe a little bit of group trade, but there was not much else in the way of a developed economy. There was very little technical change for thousands and tens of thousands of years. People were born in the same and died in the same environment in which they were born. Some of the anthropologists talk about rapid technological changes happening over a several thousand year period. So there was no Stone Axe 1 followed 6 months later by Stone Axe 2, right? Stone Axe 2 was several thousand years after Stone Axe 1. There was very little capital because people moved around a lot, and you couldn't have a lot of capital when people moved around a lot. There was very little specialization. Adam Smith's specialization is limited by the extent of the market, applied even then. So if you had a group of 50 people and there was a really good stone axe maker, he would only make axes a few days a year because that was the only demand for his product, and he would have to do other things the rest of the year. And there was conflict. The people don't like to talk about it. They like to think of the noble, peaceful savage, but in fact, conflict is a very important part of human history and prehistory. And the groups next door, you had to always watch out for them because they were, maybe you would trade with them, maybe you would trade wives with them, but maybe they would attack you in your sleep and kill you. So there was always conflict. And anthropologists who don't like to think about it, they like to think that the world was always peaceful until capitalism came along. Nonetheless, many of them realize that, in fact, we're just a nasty species and we need to be tamed. There was some exchange. There was a little bit of exchange. For example, if I had a good hunt this week, I might give you some of the meat in the expectation that you would have a good hunt next week. Or maybe I am a good stone axe maker, so I would trade you an axe for a rabbit or a fox or something of the sort. So there was some exchange, but there wasn't all that much exchange. Nonetheless, we do have, and people have documented this, we do have in our heads a pretty good cheater detection mechanism. So we're pretty good at detecting people who are cheating on a social agreement. For example, I might have a bad hunt, and you might give me some meat, but if I have a bad hunt week after week after week, you might figure out that I'm actually not doing much hunting at all. I'm out there sleeping under a tree, and you would view me as a cheater and begin not to share your food with me. That mechanism still survives, of course, but we do have a strong cheater detection mechanism, but that's more of an exchange mechanism than it is an understanding of economics mechanism. So that was the world in which our brains evolved, and they did not evolve to consider trade with China or millions of, they didn't evolve to consider societies of 300 million people. And many of these things we've learned, but we have to learn them. They're not natural. And economics is one of the things that we have to learn. So one of the major implications of the way our brains evolved is that much of our thinking is zero-sum. We think in terms of zero-sum. We think in terms of equal exchanges. And it's not just that our brains evolved that way, it's also true that we can understand much of the world that way. I use the analogy of flat earth thinking. For most of the decisions we make, most of the time, we can think of the earth as being flat, right? Unless you're a jet pilot flying great circles around the earth. But if you're just a person living in the world, you can think the earth is flat and not much will happen to you. Nothing will happen to you. You can use your GPS or your maps and get around. And there's no cost to being a believer in a flat earth because most decisions can be made on the basis of a flat earth. Same thing is true of zero-sum thinking. Many, many times, most of what goes on can be, you can think of it as zero-sum. Susie gets the cookie, John doesn't get the cookie. Or I get the job, you don't get the job. Or if we spend more on guns, we spend less on butter. Because in the short run, many resources are fixed, and in the short run, the world is zero-sum. And again, for many, many of the decisions that we can make, that we make in our day-to-day lives, we don't go far wrong if we use zero-sum thinking, which is our evolved mechanism of thinking anyway. Populism is pretty much zero-sum thinking. It's just, more jobs for me, less jobs for you. Trump, when he was running as pretty much a populist and pretty much a zero-sum sort of guy. We've got to get rid of immigrants, so there'll be more jobs for the rest of us. We have to stop trading with China so we can make more stuff ourselves. Wrong, but natural thinking. And part of the reason he did well is that and Sanders was not much different. He had a different sort of zero-sum thinking, but again, not much different. And so we have this module in our brains, and Marxism, very popular for a long time, still popular among our colleagues who aren't economists on campus, is a natural outgrowth of zero-sum thinking. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, assumes that the pie is fixed, right? The incentives don't matter, the pie is fixed, we can distribute it however we want. The labor theory of value goes back to our history as a species with very little capital, and so what was created, lo and behold, labor created things. We had, say, an axe, maybe a hut, but not too much in the way of capital goods, so we could think that labor was the way that things were created. So the popularity of Marxism Marx simply wrote down a system that was close to consistent with our evolved way of thinking about the world, and he thought he was being scientific, but he was really being pre-scientific. He was really giving a voice to folk economics, giving a voice to the kind of economics that we have if we're not trained in economics, which is what folk economics is. And because it was so consistent with the way people believed and with their evolved preferences. It's been very popular. It's intuitively very popular, but of course we all know it's wrong. We know that both from our theories we know it's wrong, and from the greatest social science experiment ever conducted, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, we know that Marxism is not doesn't work, and yet people still believe it, and part of the reason they believe it is because it is so intuitively plausible. So what are some implications? Well, if we believe in a flat Earth, it doesn't matter, right? Unless we're a jet pilot, it doesn't matter if we believe in a flat Earth. We can live our lives that way. But if we believe in zero-sum thinking, it does matter, not because it affects our day-to-day lives, but because we live in a democracy where preferences of voters or beliefs of voters influence politicians. It's not clear whether people who believe the same way that people who believe in folk economics become politicians, or people who want to become politicians must act as if they believed in folk economics. Mr. Trump seems to be maybe of the second sort. He acted as if he was a folk economist, but maybe now he's not. But at any rate, because we live in a democracy, folk economics, the economic beliefs of citizens, is very important, because citizens will vote for politicians who will then adopt policies based on folk economics. What are some other implications? Well, incentives don't matter much. If things are fixed, incentives don't matter. You can raise minimum wages, for example, with no effect because the number of poor workers is fixed. Or go back to from each according to his ability. You can tax people. The amount they produce is fixed. If you think about income inequality, which was a big deal a few years ago, if incomes are fixed, if national GDP is fixed, and some people are rich, then other people must be poor, because again, GDP is a fixed pie. That's an implication of zero-sum thinking, of folk economics. Prices. Prices serve to allocate things that are already existing. They don't serve to create new things. So if there's a hurricane, we should fix the price of goods because they're fixed, and there's no effect of fixing the price. The amount of snow shovels, or not snow shovels, shovels or ladders is given. There's no sense letting people increase the price. That's just price gouging. The supply is fixed. And more generally, price controls, we've gotten away from them in the US, fortunately, but at different times they've been very popular. And part of the reason they're popular is people don't understand the incentive effects of price controls. They think of prices as allocating a fixed amount rather than of prices as leading to more or less production of particular goods, obviously. Imports cost jobs. In a zero-sum world, the amount to be consumed is fixed. If there's imports, there's less jobs for people. It's also true that when we talk about imports, it also brings in another module. As I said, there was a lot of conflict between people in the evolutionary stage. So not only are we taking away our jobs, but we're giving them to those guys, and those guys may well be our enemies, and we don't like them because they're not us. And so that's a second reason why tariffs and other impediments to trade can be very, very popular politically, because again, they fit with two parts of the evolved folk economic module that people are carrying around in their heads. Immigration, same kind of thing. Taxes, when we talk about not we economists, not us, but when others talk about taxes, tax reform, the issue is, are the rich paying more or the poor paying more? How can we make taxes fairer? There's very little popular discussion of the effect of taxes on incentives, that if we make taxes lower, people will produce more. Sometimes comes into the debate, but it's not the natural part of people's thinking about it. People's natural thinking is taxes allocated. The government has a budget. We have to fund that budget. Let's do it fairly. And again, things are more or less viewed as fixed. Now, as I said at the beginning, we can learn differently. You know, we're smart, humans are smart, and we can learn that all of these things are not true. Everyone in this room has learned that all of these things are not true, and we can try to teach it to our students. But it has to be taught. It's not something that people who are not taught are going to understand. We saw, again, in the recent election, millions of undergraduates were rallying around Bernie Sanders. They simply did not understand really any of the things that I'm saying now, because he was sort of going in the opposite direction, and yet they believed him. They believed that his policies would have been better than a set of pro-market policies. So it's not that we're stuck on these false beliefs, but we have to be taught not to have them. I think in teaching economics, I think we really start one step too far forward. I think economics principles books, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, would do better if they started one step back. If they started with telling students, the world is not zero-sum. There are real gains from trade. Things can get, we get to gains from trade if we're lucky in the last chapter, just before the final when we do international trade. But I think if we started one step farther back, I think it would really help us, because I think students come to class with a zero-sum mindset, and we don't always address that mindset as carefully as we should. But all of these policies, all of these beliefs can be harmful because they lead to people supporting policies that are harmful. I think economists are partly to blame for this, and because of the language that we use. This is where the how do we talk about economics comes in. I think we emphasize competition way too much in our analysis of the economy. I did a study, when I say I, of course, that means a graduate student, did a study of common textbooks, and we found that competition is mentioned 8 times as often as cooperation in the textbooks. And it's a little worse than that, because often when cooperation is mentioned, it's in terms of oligopolists colluding, so cooperation is mostly ignored, and when it's not, it becomes a bad thing. So competition is stressed. Adam Smith, of course, talked about competition, but he also talked about the pin factory, which is cooperation. The analogy of competition comes from sports. If you read Stigler's famous paper on the history of the term, it turns out that the analogy comes from sports. Competition is a term from sports. In sports, there are winners and losers. Sports are zero-sum, and so when we talk about the competitive economy, remember we start off with a zero-sum mindset about the world. Then economists come and talk about competitive economy, and people say, aha, there's winners and losers in the economy. They're competing, dog eat dog. Capitalism is an evil system because it's forcing people to compete and creating winners and losers. So the emphasis on competition reinforces our zero-sum thinking that comes from our folk economic beliefs. Of course, there is competition. I don't want to downplay the role of competition. Competition is very important in an economy. But what is competition? What are firms competing for? They're competing for the right to cooperate. They're competing for the right to sell you stuff, and selling you stuff is a cooperative act. A transaction, the fundamental unit of economics, is a cooperative act, and so when people are competing, they are competing for the right to cooperate. So when Amazon and Walmart compete, what they're competing for is the right to cooperate with other people. They're not competing to put each other out of business, although that may be a byproduct, but what they're competing for really is the right to cooperate. What function does competition have? Competition chooses the best cooperators. So whoever wins in the competitive race, that's another way of saying that party is the best cooperator. They won because they do the best job of cooperating. rather than because they're the best. They're the best competitor, but but the purpose of being the best competitor is to cooperate with. If you're buying, it's to cooperate with sellers. If you're selling, it's to cooperate with buyers. In a way, it's strange that economists do emphasize competition to the extent that we do, for a few reasons. First of all, go back to our model of pure competition, the one that we love. No competition in pure competition, right? The essence of pure competition is every seller ignores every other seller because all sellers are so small that none of them can affect the market. No competition. We talk about the competitive model, and yet in the competitive model, there is no competition. The only assumption is that people are free to trade with each other, and trade is, as I said, a cooperative act. So we call our model pure competition, and it confuses lay people because when they think of competition, they think of Ford and General Motors and Toyota. But in our model of competition, there's none of those guys. There are only little guys who are trading small amounts and ignoring each other. So it's in a way strange that we call our model pure competition because it is not competitive. Competition itself is not the goal of an economy either. As I said, competition is to sort out the best cooperator. But what's the goal of an economy? Well, to the extent that the economy can said to have a goal, its goal is to maximize consumer surplus. Where does that come from? That comes from buying and selling or from exchange. That's where consumer surplus comes from. Competition, again, is good because it enables us to sort out the best cooperators, the best people to buy and sell from, but it isn't essentially the goal. It's a tool to make the cooperative economy work better. It's not the goal of the economy itself. Moreover, competition is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. A market economy does not distinguish itself from a traditional economy or a Marxist economy by the fact there's competition. There's always competition. Humans are competitive. Darwinism tells us that, and there's always some sort of competition. So it's not that market economies are unique by having competition. They're just an example of every economy is. So when you say this is a competitive economy, the Russian economy was also competitive. People were competing for different things in different ways, but they were competing just as we're competing in our economy. If we look at the discipline of marketing, marketing actually does a pretty good job. Economists were snobs. We don't like to think about marketing, but marketing actually does a better job of describing the cooperation between buyers and sellers and the goal of sellers in finding out how they can best cooperate with buyers. So marketing actually does a pretty good job of looking at that. Moreover, cooperation is, I claim, much more important than competition in an economy. The basic unit of economics is a transaction. Transaction is a cooperative act. Both buyers and sellers gain from cooperation. They must agree to cooperate, or there's no transaction, and they must both expect to gain, or again, they will not transact with each other. Moreover, cooperation is vastly more common than is competition. Think of yourself as an economist. You compete when you're in the job market, your first time, you're competing with a dozen, maybe 2 dozen other economists. As you go through your career, you're competing for maybe better jobs, maybe prizes, the Nobel Prize, the Clark Award. You're competing for space in journals. But in all those cases, you're competing with a relatively small subset of people, and in fact, you're cooperating with all other economists. How are you cooperating with them? Well, you couldn't do your work if other economists hadn't done their work. Starting with Adam Smith, maybe, you could not write papers if there were not things to say. And in fact, the current measure of the productivity of a scholar is citations, and a citation is essentially a measure of cooperation. When you cite someone's paper, you are cooperating with that person. You are using the information that they provided in order to advance your own particular argument. So a citation is an example of cooperation, but more generally, all economists are cooperating to generate the literature, the knowledge that we have of economics. And of course, once you take an economist outside of the role of an economist, we're cooperating with everybody. We go to the store, we cooperate with merchants, we cooperate, every product we buy is a huge wave of cooperation. So in economics, and we have theories of cooperation, specialization, gains from trade, division of labor, as I say, going back to the pin factory, all of these are specific examples of cooperation, but it's my claim that we have not emphasized those enough in our research and in our talking, and that we have overemphasized the role of competition, which brings us back to our zero-sum way of thinking, rather than realizing that the economy is cooperative. In a sense, you can think of the markets as creating huge waves of competition. Huge waves of cooperation. We're cooperating with people all over the world, people who are dead, who produce things that we use. We're cooperating with people who aren't born yet, who will use things that we produce. The economy, in my view, is the largest engine of cooperation that has ever been conceived. I won't say invented because no one invented it, but the largest engine of cooperation that has ever occurred in the history of the world. And it's hugely cooperative, and yet we call it competitive. And I think we are losing something by doing that. I want to be careful. When I say cooperation, I don't want you to think of me as some sort of soft New Age guy. Oh, let's all love each other. You can be as hard-edged as you want. I like the example of Scrooge from Charles Dickens' anti-market Screed, A Christmas Carol. Scrooge was the meanest guy in markets ever described. What did he do that was so mean? He lent money to people, right? Every act that he did, lending money, in fact, was a cooperative act. And by being Scrooge-like, by lending on harsh terms, he was able to lend money to people who needed it the most. Later, he became soft, and we don't care about him. But at the beginning, he was a very sound economic man. He was, the caricature, and yet he was very cooperative. And the reason your rational, selfish economic person, we can make them men, women, are kinder, but your rational, selfish economic man is cooperative is not because he's kind and good, it's because we must cooperate in order to maximize our own utility. We compete as well, but cooperation is a very important part of what we do. So what are the implications? Again, as I've said, emphasis on competition reinforces zero-sum thinking. It reinforces the thinking that there are winners and losers. Sports, poker, those are games of competition. Politics is pretty much competition, although there's coalitions formed in politics. But an election is one winner and one loser. Those are competition. And people tend to think mostly as competition as bad. Economists don't. We like competition. But most people think competition, except in sports, is a bad thing because they think, well, there's winners and losers in competition. If there's losers, they suffer, they're harmed, they feel sorry for them. On the other hand, cooperation is win-win. Both parties can win from cooperation. So my point is that by emphasizing competition, economists are enforcing or reinforcing this zero-sum or win-lose way of thinking, and it makes people think less well of the capitalist or of the market economy when they think of it as an economy of winners and losers. I like to use the example of Walmart. So Walmart moves to town, and a bunch of mom and pop stores go out of business. What happened? Well, there are two ways of describing what happened. The conventional way is to say Walmart outcompeted them and drove them out of business, and all the mom and pop stores lost, and Walmart won. Isn't that a shame? Walmart's big and they're little, and yet Walmart outcompeted them and drove them out of business. The other metaphor is to say Walmart out-cooperated them. Walmart offered goods and services to people at better prices and terms than the mom and pop stores. They did a better job of cooperating with their customers, and that's why the other stores went out of business. We can tell either story. They're both true, but one story has a very different psychological connotation than the other. The cooperative story focuses on what Walmart did right. The competitive story focuses on what Walmart did wrong. And I think economists, not only in our teaching, but in our writing, when we write op-eds or when we're called by the news to comment on something, I think if we keep this cooperative notion in mind, we can do a better job of convincing people that markets are good rather than having them go away with the idea that markets are not good. Income inequality, again, you can say, well, poor people are outcompeted in the marketplace and that's why they're poor, or you can say poor people don't have much to sell and they can't cooperate very well because they don't have much to sell, and let's help them figure out a better way to cooperate than otherwise. What's a successful firm? The successful firm is the best cooperator, not the best competitor. Of course, special interest firms, special interests sometimes reinforce that competitive way of thinking. If you're an import competing firm and you want a tariff, you will stress the competitive nature of international trade. And it's easy to do, again, because people tend to believe that way. I have enough time left. I want to talk a little bit about what's called pathological altruism, which is a notion that the psychologists have just invented, but I think economists should make much more use of it. Pathological altruist is a person who serially engages in what tends to be altruistic, but actually harms the person they're trying to help. Couple of examples that the psychologists give. When you see someone else is sad and you think it's your fault, then that's maybe pathological altruism. Inequality, again, feeling sorry for the poor can be an example of pathological altruism. And many kinds of regulation are exactly that, a minimum wage. Again, you can think of it as confusion. If you think that people are poor because they're outcompeted, then you try to change the terms of competition, minimum wage. If you think people are poor because they don't have opportunities to cooperate, then you want to increase their opportunities to cooperate, and a minimum wage reduces their opportunities to cooperate, takes away possibilities that they might have. So to the extent that we diagnose social problems as due to excessive competition, when they're really due to failures of cooperation, then we can end up making things worse because we're viewing them through a competitive lens rather than a cooperative lens. Some examples, minimum wage, tariffs, price controls. Bruce Yandel has talked about bootleggers and Baptists, a coalition between bootleggers who want to sell illegal liquor on Sundays and Baptists who want people not to drink on Sundays, and they form a coalition to prevent the sale of liquor on Sundays. There are many, many examples of that, of where an interest group will coerce someone into supporting their position, and in fact, the person who's supporting it is often hurting the very people that it wants to help. Environmentalists and solar power firms, drug companies, and safety advocates say, let's not import drugs from Canada. The European discussion of frankenfoods, foods that are created by genetic manipulation, the Europeans weren't very good at it, the Americans were, and so the European food producers convinced the European consumers that these were bad. They were frankenfoods. They should be banned from Europe. Safety advocates and food producers performing a pathologically altruistic act together. Finally, this has implications for how we view the market. If we think of the market as competitive, then we think that it's harmful. People are doing bad things. Some people say, well, markets, they have their downside, they're really bad things, but they produce goods and services, so we have to tolerate them because they do these good things, even though they're a fundamentally immoral force. If we think of the market as cooperative, then we don't need to think that way. Then we can think, well, the market is cooperative, it's a good way to do things, and it's doing good things. We don't have to apologize because the market itself is cooperative and it is producing goods and services. People that succeed in the market, it's not that they're the most ruthless competitors. People that succeed in the market succeed because they are doing the very best job of cooperating with others, and we don't have to worry about them. There's a whole notion now of giving back that strikes me as perverted. Bill Gates produced huge amounts of wealth by producing Microsoft. He's choosing to give some of that wealth away, and that's fine, but it's not that he's giving back because he did bad things by producing Microsoft. By creating Microsoft, he did a really good thing, and if he chooses to give away his wealth, that's fine, but he doesn't have to give back because he hasn't done anything wrong in the first place. He's done something very, very useful. He's been a hugely beneficial and efficient cooperator in the marketplace. So if we think of the market as being cooperative rather than as being competitive, then we have a whole different view of the market. And I think if we economists could change our terms of discourse a bit and emphasize the cooperative nature of markets, I think we could do something to reduce the dislike of markets that we observe. This is based on some papers I've written over the years, and as I say, it's in the process of becoming a book. I'll take questions, I guess. I still have time for questions. Thank you. I can't see you, so if you could.
Way in the back. Right in the back.
All right. Thank you, Professor. I like cooperation a lot more than competition, and I like Bastiat's harmonization of interest metaphor a lot as well. So I would like to know your opinion on the role of aesthetics, the role of thinking in terms of like beauty, and because when I think of harmony, I think of rhythm and vibrancy and music, and so I'd like to know your opinion on that, both for like in terms of strategy, in terms of trying to convince others of the importance of markets, but also in thinking about economics per se. And then to that, and also like the role of the mathematization of economics, because that the sort of literature that comes out of that way of thinking is often very static and difficult for not just like average individuals, but also even some scholars. You have a fragmentation of literature that even special economists can't. You have to learn a new vocabulary to understand. So,
sort of like reading Mises. So I like country music, but otherwise I have little opinion about aesthetics and none as an economist. In terms of mathematization, that's the way the profession is going. I don't think you would have to change that way. You can still do economics the same way you do it if you thought about it as cooperation. I'm thinking more about economics at the individual, at the policy level, which is informed by the math, but it takes a long time, or economics at the textbook level, the how do we talk about economics level, rather than at the highly theoretical levels. I don't do that. I used to do a little more, but I don't do that stuff much anymore. But I don't have anything against it. I just think that's a different sort of universe than this one. Although I do think, this is an argument I've lost at my own school, but I do think that we would do better teaching basic economics to more students rather than teaching more advanced, more mathematical economics to undergraduates to fewer numbers of students. But that's a separate kind of issue. But undergraduate economics departments are becoming more technical as well, and I think that's really hurting the world, because I think students would do better to learn more economics, even if they didn't learn it at a technical level.
Hi. So I really appreciated your talk. I think there's a lot of truth in this talk. I think we get way too caught up in the sort of negative aspects of how people interact. To that end, though, I'm just kind of curious. I was trying to think through it while you were speaking, and would there be any dangers in an overemphasis on cooperation versus like an overemphasis on competition if we went too far? Specifically in regards that most cooperation, like you said right now, is caught up in these ideas of collusion and things like that.
I guess we could go too far. I think we're a long way from that now, and at some point we may go too far, but I don't see that happening for a while, for my lifetime, because I think we're so far away from discussions of from overemphasis on cooperation. I think we need first to give it its due, and then see if we don't, and then try to avoid going too far. So I don't think we're very near that yet.
Hi, that was a great talk. So I'm in health services research, and what I was thinking about when you first started talking about zero-sum thinking is that I think a lot of my professors and colleagues exhibit a lot of zero-sum thinking, but I think the way I usually think about it is that there's just all kinds of unintended consequences when CMS or ACA, will have a new regulation, or when accountable care organizations came out, all the policy wonks and scholars and academics were saying, oh, this is going to save us so much, and this is going to have all these great outcomes, and it doesn't turn out that way. And, I look at that as unintended consequences. So I guess my question to you is the zero-sum thinking, kind of the main cause of these kind of unintended consequences, or is there a lot more involved with it? If you could say a little bit about that.
Interesting. It's often the cause. I know, for example, when Medicare was adopted, people said that it would cost so much, and of course it cost a huge amount more. You could say that's an unintended consequence, or you could say that was zero-sum thinking. People didn't fully account for the fact that once you make something free, many more people are going to consume it. My own belief is that most bad economic policies can ultimately trace back to zero-sum thinking. I think the more I think about it, as I've thought about it over the years, I think I've put more and more emphasis on it as the fundamental error that people make. The cognitive psychologists have identified lots of errors, but I think, for policy at least, I think zero-sum thinking is probably the most important. And I think many of you're right, what you call unintended consequences are not realizing that once we change a price, people are going to respond to that change in price in ways that we may not fully anticipate.
You cited Brian Kaplan's book, The Myth of...
I'm sorry?
You cited Brian Kaplan's book on the myth of the rational voter. And in addition to limited sum game, he also talks about magical thinking about economics, that the government can do magical things by creating jobs or wealth. What are your thoughts on that?
It's been a while since I read his book. I think it's a very good book. I think that is, that's an example. Part of that may be, again, back to zero-sum thinking. You can just hire more people without having any other kind of effect. But he had several fallacies. I emphasized the anti-market bias because that was the one that was most relevant for my talk. But I think all of his points are very, very strong points.
Hi, thank you for your talk. How synonymous is profit with competition for folk economics?
Profit is probably another term that I should address in the book. People tend to view profits as being bad, and of course we economists emphasize that most of what's called profit is return on capital. Some of the rest is an incentive, and to the extent that zero-sum economics ignores incentives, then it would also ignore the important role of profits in driving people. So you're right, that's another term that, that I will consider as I'm writing this.
I think, and I just wanted you to comment on this, I think the greatest example today of zero-sum thinking is the sustainability movement in environmentalism, where their basic understanding is that every use of a resource today is the denial of the use of that resource to some future generation, to some future person, and the reason we should conserve today is not to take away from the future. So this is a zero-sum exchange between the present and the future, and I think that's affected views, and well, actually it came from the UN, but it's affected lots of policy in EPA policy, in Interior Department policy, local land use planning policy. I mean, you can go down the line, and it seems to be the worst example. It's the one we're struggling the most with today.
Well, I can't agree with that because my university is often voted the most sustainable in the country. I'm glad my grandparents didn't think that way. That's me funny.
I greatly enjoyed your talk as well. Since you mentioned Brian Kaplan, he also wrote this thing, Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist.
That was
So-
Buchanan.
I'm sorry?
Oh, was that Brian? Okay, I'm sorry.
Brian Kaplan wrote Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist. And if you're not familiar with that, could you give a comment on how you see Austrian economics as part of the profession? Is it positive, negative, neutral? How do you assess quintessentially Austrian economics, which, at least in my view, is distinct from mainstream neoclassical economics?
I was hoping no one would ask me that. So I like Austrian economics. I've given papers at Mario Rizzo's seminar in New York, and I'm here, and I've even published in an Austrian journal. I find it, as a working economist, I find it difficult to do Austrian economics. For example, I read one of Israel Kirchner's books, and I took the book and I said, this is really great, and now I'm going to, and I couldn't finish that sentence. So that's my own take on Austrian economics, is that I have found it personally an area that I found difficult to work in, where I read, say, Richard Posner's Law and Economics book, and I was able to write many, many articles based on insights from that book. I haven't found that from Austrian economics. Otherwise, I say, I like the conclusions, I like the analysis, but I don't find it a terribly useful paradigm for me.
Dr. Rubin, if I might, would you agree that the Austrian theory of subjective value applied to man in the Paleolithic applied? That is, did it operate in the Paleolithic, the Austrian theory of subjective value? And then, assuming that you would agree, does that argue for a multitude of positive sum transactions in the Paleolithic? That is, if each party to a trade thought that they had the better of the deal by way of the subjective theory of value, was not positive sum transactions in operation?
Well, I don't know that you need subjective value to have positive sum transactions. The problem in the Paleolithic was there wasn't all that much to exchange. Adam Smith's example of a beaver for a deer, or crops, women, division of labor. It's true, although wrong to say it, but females were more gatherers and males were more hunters, and there was division of labor and exchange in the family. But there wasn't that much stuff. There wasn't that much stuff to exchange, and there was a small group, and so I don't think there was a huge amount of exchange, just because it was a very simple economy. There weren't a lot of things to exchange for each other. I don't know that subjective value helps or hurts with that analysis, but you have to have stuff to trade before you can trade.
And then, even so, in that context of the tribe or the clan, wasn't it a situation of coercion by the group and perhaps resentment? And a feeling that, yeah, my effort toward a positive sum transaction, toward a subjective theory of value is frustrated by that coercion?
I don't think so. The best evidence is by a guy named Boehm, an anthropologist at UCLA, who says that the tribal groups, the primitive groups, were probably very democratic. Although again, we must be careful, but probably with respect to men more than women, but that decisions were made by the group, and he talks about upstarts, someone who would try to engross too much power, and how the band would either simply walk away or kill him. So the claim was that our ancestors at that time were relatively free, our male ancestors anyway, were relatively free from coercion, and whatever exchange went on, I don't think anyone would have stopped it. I don't see why they would have stopped it.
Hi. At my school, I teach evening classes with adult learners, and then I have traditional students. And with my adult learners, talking about competition, they seem to be fairly okay with that. But with the millennials, I have to change my language to be much more talking about the cooperative nature of markets, and I found much more success that way. Have you looked at how, the effects on the different generations, like the millennials, and in terms of cooperation and such, because they seem to respond to that?
I haven't. That's interesting. I just was reading something online that millennials think about things very differently, but I haven't. I just teach the same stuff. I asked I was teaching a chapter on free speech, and I asked my law and economics class, mostly juniors and seniors, I said, I assume I've done a lot of microaggressions in this course, and they all laughed. So, but they may be self-selective if they take my class not to be expecting too much in the way of New Age stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lunch is downstairs in the covered area. The program begins again at 12:45.